Hello YouTube, it's Tony. So today I'll show you 10 general tips and tricks on how to learn any boss in RuneScape, mainly soloable bosses. Here is my PVM background. I started learning how to boss in 2019, so my perspective is pretty fresh. Nowadays, I can pretty much kill any boss in this game. A lot of people ask, what are some tips on learning X boss when they're new to this? Hopefully this video will answer a lot of your questions, and do note that some of these tips will overlap others. In this video, what is my definition of learning and what's the difference between mastering? Learning is when you're new or inexperienced at a boss and you're trying to get successful kills. I consider my first 10 to 30 kills as learner kills, maybe even more than that. Mastering, on the other hand, is if you have a lot of experience and you know the mechanics, but you're looking to polish the rotations, use less food, kill faster, and make lots of money from this. Now obviously that varies from person to person, so these tips may or may not be suited for you. The very first tip I have for you is beta server or practice mode. Now beta servers are occasionally open on RuneScape. The progress you make on beta servers do not carry over to the main game server. However, luckily you can import your main game server progress and then save that on beta server. This means that you can buy all the supplies you need, then import save on beta server and use them free of cost. Also, if someone on beta server trades you over a tier 92 weapon, he or she won't lose it on the main server. While people could argue that, oh Tony, you would miss out on a unique drop if you were on beta server, but you gotta remember that when you're learning a boss, you're gonna die a lot more often than getting a kill, so the cost of supplies and death will outweigh this. Personally, I started relearning Telos on beta server, and despite rolling 3 uniques, I do not regret camping 2 full weeks on this, as this eventually taught me how to get 15 orb sets in total. Once you know how to kill the boss, you have more chances to get more kills, and thus more chances to get a drop. However, since beta server is rarely open, practice mode is the alternative choice, although you'll still consume supplies. We did however get a free death week back in January, so that was really nice for a lot of people learning new bosses. My overall tip for this is just do practice mode until you're comfortable with the mechanics. The second tip I have for you is focusing more on survival rather than DPS. Look, I understand that DPSing through mechanics is generally a common strategy for most bosses, and yes, the more DPS you do, the fewer mechanics you have to deal with, and thus you'll use less food, right? Not to mention that eating solid foods and drinking Saradomin brews would lower your adrenaline and stats, thus giving the boss more room to use mechanics, right? However, despite all this, what I'll tell you is don't be afraid to use Sailfish and Saradomin brews with a Beast of Burden setup as a beginner. So in turn, I would suggest you learn how to combo eat, and if you don't know what that is, you would keep buying the solid food and brew, then press them quickly so that you can heal 3.4k in one tick. Now, I know a lot of high level players will clown me for this, but in order to learn anything, you gotta see the boss more often so that you can reach the deeper phases. More opportunities to reach the deeper phases equals more practice. We generally get better with more experience, so you'll get that by seeing the boss more often. After all, you're not going for decent kills at first. When you're new to something, we all need what are called training wheels. Obviously, you don't want to do this all the way down the road because, as I said before, eating more equals more mechanics and less food in your inventory. As you go along, just find ways to reduce food usage slowly. Then when you get to the point where you can kill with minimal food usage, consider swapping to a combat familiar setup. Every boss I've learned to this day, I started at first using a Beast of Burden. The third tip we have is mechanic prioritization. So boss guides will explain each and every single mechanic, and as a reader, do you think you're gonna memorize all of this? Probably not. You are certainly gonna struggle to deal with some mechanics, so it's gonna be very overwhelming. This is why people panic whenever a mechanic shows up. What I want you to do is look at the boss guide and think to yourself, what is the most important mechanic you wanna sit on and look out for? Let's use Raksha for example. He attacks with all 3 combat styles, and every 4 attacks he does a special in this order. Now, while his auto attack does fairly high damage, it will not kill you in one hit. However, the mechanic's even more dangerous because not only can it stun you, but it could otherwise deal rapid damage. So, the way I learned Raksha is count every 4th auto attack, and then deal with the mechanic. Once they nerfed Rakshas auto attacks, I didn't really focus too much on prayer flicks. There are so many different mechanics when it comes to Telos, like look at this chart. I'm gonna go with hold still as is perhaps the most dangerous. In this case, if I'm sitting on hold still, I'd anticipate within 3 auto attacks after the previous mechanic that's leading up to hold still has passed. This way I can res the hold still for a huge amount of healing, and I will not get stunned by Telos. Now there are so many examples of this, but you just gotta figure out which mechanics have the highest chance of death. In terms of other mechanics, they can be ignored later down the road because they're not as big of a threat as the others. Examples include Nexus contain this because you can avoid this by keeping distance from her. Tip number 4, using Revolution and understanding abilities. If you're new to this boss, don't be afraid to use Revolution even though full manual is better DPS. It lets you focus on the boss mechanics rather than trying to figure out what ability to press next. I would generally use Revolution while manually hitting thresholds and ultimates. Also, it is important to understand generally how abilities work. This information is covered in my Beginner Revolution DPS guide, so please check this out. Do note that Revolution bar setups may vary for certain bosses. While some boss guides will spreadsheet their ability rotations, but those are for perfect fast kills. For beginners, it's really overwhelming to understand why a certain ability is used in this order. If you're looking at an ability rotation spreadsheet for a certain boss, then what you want to do is highlight what are the most important abilities to use first. It's usually either the thresholds or the ultimate. After you get the feel of this boss, then using spreadsheet rotations will make the kill go smoothly. Now, you don't have to be a DPS expert to learn a boss, but rather, just have a general idea on what abilities to prioritize. This point may contradict with another because DPS and Revolution don't go in the same sentence. The way I learned DPS with Revolution is set up a bar where you have the highest damaging abilities first. Then when I'm more comfortable at this boss, I would manually hit thresholds and eventually use a full ultimate ability rotation. The next tip we have is using keybinds. Now some bosses you'll need defensive abilities once in a while, eating food, swapping prayers, etc. Clicking more often can lead to errors. When I say keybinds, you don't need something really fancy like a mouse with side buttons. Of course, they'll definitely help with weapon switches and prayer flicks and such, but I even did every boss without this. Keybinds in general are more about personal preference. Now, I do have a keybind guide within the same playlist if you want to take a look at this. As you learn these bosses and get comfortable with certain keybinds, you will slowly add more to your arsenal. This ties into my next tip, and that is defensive abilities. Sometimes you won't be able to survive solely off eating food, and this is when using defensives become important. Here are a couple of ideal defensive ability examples. Some defenses require shields, so I highly suggest you keybind this. Resonance is really nice because you can heal off a big hit. Debilitate requires no shield, which will half the damage for a certain duration. Then Reflect can reduce the damage even further, although this time it requires a shield. But yeah, I do have a full beginner guide on how to use defensive abilities, so pick which ones will suit you. If you find that a shield switch is a little too complicated when it comes to using defensives, then you can otherwise use a main hand plus a defender setup. Now, this is only recommended for the first few kills. Regardless though, having knowledge of defensive abilities on the back of your head can really save you from an emergency situation. Tip number 7, record and evaluate your kills. With how many people watch bossing content on YouTube, Twitch, Discord, etc., don't be afraid to record your kill attempts. Try to look at yourself in the mirror and see what you did wrong and how you could have done better, one step at a time. It's always nice to have a replay just to see exactly what you died to. Also, having another pair of eyes will help you comprehend better if another person reviews this. Now, recording might look hard if you don't have recording equipment, but luckily for you, you can download OBS for free so you can record this, then upload this to Streamable or YouTube. You can either look at this yourself or share it with friends. Tip number 8, panic points. Gradually eliminate panic points throughout the fight. Where do you get shaky the most? The more nervous you are, the less likely you are to focus, and the more likely you lose track. This is similar to my mechanic prioritization tip, but this time you're gonna find a point where you panic run, or eat the most. I used to panic a lot on P4 Araxor because of the prayer flakes, but I found a way to calm this down after reading the attack patterns. Another example of this would be when I see Shadow Hands at ED1 Siru, because they can really hit 4k per tick. Whenever I would see them, I would just simply move out of the way so that I'm nowhere close to stepping on this. Coming in at tip number 9, we have patience. Please be patient at learning any boss. If you can kill any boss in this game on your first try, then you are truly gifted. I have seen people trying to break their keyboard just because they died to a Araxor after a few tries. And then of course there may be people that are laughing at you because, oh, I took 100 tries at Rax, but think about this. Everyone learns at their own pace. Don't feel bad just because you hit a brick wall. It happened to me a lot, especially with Telos if you remembered the Bossing the Max Cash series, where I lost 1 bill learning this. A common mistake for getting into PVM is people expecting this to be profitable for the first few kills just because a guide says the average profit. Oh, and just because you think you'll get that unique drop. Money doesn't come until you get the feel of this boss, so please do not expect any profit. You want to be committed towards improving a boss, but at the same time, you want to avoid getting to the point where you want to beat yourself up just because you're stuck in mud. And the 10th and final tip would be, refresh yourself. This ties in with my previous point, as I tend to be very impatient. Learning a boss can be extremely frustrating and demoralizing when you die too often. Rather than brute force your way or obsessively binging to learn that same boss, take a break. This way, when you feel less pressure and resentment, it'll be easier to get this boss down. Remember when I had 2 out of 3 orbs at Telos back in the Bossing the Max Cast series, and everyone told me, oh Tony, you should complete the orb set, right? Not to mention that some people thought I was an idiot for not doing this to finish the series, but rather I told them that it was better for me to learn the boss patiently instead. And guess what? It really did pay off because I was able to get myself several orb sets. When I say refresh yourself, either play another game than Runescape, or find a secondary boss that you enjoy besides trying to attempt to learn this boss, or even just do another Runescape side activity like maxing or something. These tips have helped me learn pretty much every boss in Runescape. Obviously there's room for perfecting as I'm not a top tier PVMer, but this is a gateway to where I am today. All in all, it's all about taking it slow and steady and not forcing yourself to do everything. Now that I've explained my 10 tips, what are some tips you want to provide to others? So yeah, thanks for watching and I hope it helps. If I missed anything, feel free to ask. Also, be sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already, because I will do more guides like this in the future.